That's too bad.
What are you doing, Dad? Dad, what are you doing?
You probably know that the film industry loves the phrase based on true events. And yeah, sometimes they do get close to the truth, but as you'll see in today's video, the truth always remains much more horrifying than anything you'd ever imagine watching the movie based on it alone. I am absolutely addicted to watching movies, especially the ones based on true stories, but these ones, I wished I never watched them, simply because the true versions haunt me till this day. Viewer discretion is heavily advised. In the early hours of April 26, 2008, Austrian authorities found themselves staring at a medical mystery. A 19-year-old woman named Kerstin was in critical condition, unresponsive, and suffering from symptoms no doctor could fully explain. Her grandfather, a man named Josef Fritzl, stood beside her and offered a story that unraveled faster than the girl's vital signs. He claimed Kerstin's mother, his own daughter, had joined Occult decades earlier, cut ties, and occasionally left children on his doorstep like parcels needing care. The doctors didn't believe him. The police didn't either. Something about his explanations felt mechanical, as if he were reciting lines rather than describing events. The details didn't match reality. They didn't even match each other. Investigators pressed him. They asked where Elizabeth was. They demanded verifiable records. Fritzl stalled. He repeated phrases, rearranged timelines, and behaved like a man whose lies had never been challenged before. This was not the panic of someone caught off guard. It was the confusion of someone who had controlled the narrative for so long, he'd forgotten how truth works in the hands of people who don't belong to him. Nobody was prepared for what they were about to find. For 24 years, since August 28, 1984, Elizabeth had been living beneath the same house where police now stood. She wasn't missing. She wasn't dead. She wasn't part of a cult. She was in a hidden complex below ground that Josef Fritzl had designed, expanded and maintained, with the kind of devotion most people reserve for careers or hobbies. The level of preparation was so extreme that it bordered on engineering obsession: multiple reinforced doors, electronic locks, ventilation systems, and structural modifications executed without raising suspicion. He hid the entrance behind shelving in a basement workshop. Anyone walking past saw only clutter and tools. The real doorway was concealed behind objects chosen specifically to look boring. It was camouflage made from domestic normality. To reach the chamber, investigators followed Fritzl through a sequence of locked spaces: a corridor, a storage area, another door, another lock, each step more surreal than the last. When he finally opened the final barrier, the air shifted. They weren't stepping into a criminal hideout. They were stepping into an alternate timeline, a place where an entire family had grown up without sunlight, without neighbors, without any sense that the world contained options. The first thing they found wasn't a prison. It was a home. That made it infinitely worse. Inside lived Elizabeth and 3 of her children, all born underground. They had beds, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and improvised decorations marking birthdays and holidays. Someone had tried to create normalcy in a space where normal wasn't possible. The walls showed evidence of attempts to expand the living area. Concrete chipped away slowly, year after year, as if space itself were earned through labor rather than given by nature. One of the boys had grown taller than the ceiling, and spent his life walking at an angle because the architecture of his world physically prevented him from standing straight. When your environment reshapes your bones, it doesn't just imprison your body, it edits your identity. The children above ground faced a different confusion. They'd been raised by Fritzl and his wife, registered legally through paperwork supported by letters that Elizabeth supposedly wrote. Those letters were carefully structured, using phrases meant to suggest autonomy, while avoiding any details that would be easy to verify. In hindsight, they read more like communiques, written under supervision than correspondence from a woman living freely. Social services accepted them. Foster arrangements were approved. Authorities asked no questions. Nobody wondered why a woman who had supposedly fled home years earlier kept returning only long enough to abandon infants at her parents' doorstep, then vanish again without ever being seen. The entire system swallowed the story because the alternative was unthinkable. Meanwhile, neighbors heard odd noises from the basement over the years. Fritzl dismissed them as plumbing issues. People believed him. They continued renting rooms from him. They shared walls with a nightmare they never recognized because the human mind routinely protects itself from possibilities that feel too grotesque to exist. Fritzl didn't need to hide the truth with brilliance. He hid it with audacity. Once Elizabeth was freed, the narrative that Fritzl had curated for 24 years collapsed in days. DNA analysis confirmed that every detail he had constructed was a lie. His justifications shifted from logistics to psychology. He described the underground world as something he managed, as if responsibility and possession were interchangeable concepts. He spoke about routines, chores, and celebrations, as if those things cancelled out everything else. He believed consistency was a form of care. He believed control was a kind of love. His statements revealed something chilling. He didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as necessary. At trial, jurors watched hours of Elizabeth's recorded testimony. The footage was so overwhelming they had to take breaks because the mind has limits, and reality does not care where they are. When Elizabeth appeared in person, disguised, silent, Fritzl saw her and something inside him cracked. He changed his plea. Whatever fantasy he'd lived collapsed the instant he could no longer pretend Elizabeth existed, only in the environment he controlled. Josef Fritzl received a life sentence. He now spends his days in a converted monastery, cut off from the empire he created beneath his own home. Elizabeth and her children were relocated, assigned new identities, and given access to medical and psychological care. The ones raised underground had to learn what the sky was. They had to understand that a door can open without permission. They had to rewire instinct. Even after all of this, the question that refuses to die isn't how Fritzl did it. The question is how nobody else noticed, how a house can contain two realities separated by a staircase, how a family can exist above another family without ever hearing the sound of their existence, how a society can be so certain of its own safety that it fails to look beneath the floorboards. Lifetime made a movie about a version of this story. The real version doesn't end when the door opens. It ends when people stop assuming that the unthinkable is impossible. In 2003, a low-budget survival thriller called Open Water was released, written and directed by husband and wife filmmakers Chris Kentis and Laura Lau, both experienced scuba divers themselves. They wanted the film to feel as real as possible, and it was. The actors weren't surrounded by special effects or green screens. They were actually in the water, surrounded by real Caribbean reef and blacktip sharks. A shark handler floated nearby just off camera as the actors treaded water for hours while filming. The story concerns an American couple who go scuba diving while on vacation, only to find themselves stranded miles from shore in shark-filled waters when the crew of their boat accidentally leaves them behind. Behind the film's success lies a real-life story that inspired it: the disappearance of Tom and Eileen Lonergan. Thomas Lonergan and his wife Eileen Haynes were a quiet, adventurous couple. Both were graduates of Louisiana State University. They met in college, fell in love, and got married in Texas. They weren't thrill seekers, but they loved travel and the outdoors. After college, they joined the Peace Corps, spending 2 years teaching on Tuvalu, a small remote island in the Pacific. After that, they took another assignment in Fiji. They were experienced divers. In early 1998, they decided to take a break from their work and spend time exploring Australia's Great Barrier Reef. It was meant to be the trip of a lifetime. On January 25, 1998, Tom and Eileen boarded the Outer Edge, a dive boat operated by a local company in Port Douglas, Queensland. The boat carried 26 passengers that day, including the couple. The destination was St. Crispin's Reef, one of the region's most popular dive sites, a mosaic of coral and blue water about 25 miles from shore. They dove 3 times that day. The sea was calm, visibility clear. On their last dive, sometime after 3 p.m., the group returned to the surface, all except Tom and Eileen. Somehow, in the rush of checking tanks and counting heads, no one noticed they were missing. The Outer Edge pulled anchor and left for shore, leaving the couple behind in open water. It wasn't until 2 days later, January 27th, that anyone realized what had happened. When the Outer Edge was cleaned and prepared for another trip, a crew member found a canvas bag left behind. Inside were 2 wallets, a logbook, and clothes, all belonging to the Lonergans. That was when the truth hit. The couple had never returned from the reef. A massive air and sea search began immediately. Helicopters swept the area and patrol boats with divers moved across hundreds of miles of sea, but there was no sign of them. Days later, small clues began to appear. In February 1998, a woman's wetsuit washed ashore on a beach in North Queensland, about 75 miles from where they'd last been seen. It matched Eileen's size. Marine biologists studying the barnacles attached to the fabric determined it had been submerged since January. There was no evidence of a shark attack. Then in June 1998, more of their gear surfaced on a beach near Port Douglas, 121 kilometers, about 75 miles, from St. Crispin's Reef. The items were unmistakably theirs. 2 inflatable dive jackets with the Lonergans' names written on them, and a small white board used for writing underwater. On it, written in shaky, desperate handwriting, were these words: Monday, January 26, 1998. To anyone who can help us, we have been abandoned on Agincourt Reef by MV Outer Edge on Monday, January 25th, 1998. Please help us before we die. That note proved that Tom and Eileen had survived at least a full day after the boat left. The discovery fueled countless theories. Some speculated that they might have staged their disappearance, faking their deaths to start a new life somewhere else, or ending their time at sea intentionally. These rumors came from Tom's personal diary, which police later found in their belongings. In one entry, he wrote about wanting a quick and peaceful end. Eileen's writings said she would stay by his side no matter the outcome. But Eileen's parents insisted those quotes were ripped out of context and that much of the diary was never made public. They said the two were deeply in love and had every reason to live. Police agreed. Their bank accounts were untouched. Their insurance policies remained unclaimed. They had left everything behind. Experts testified that dehydration and exhaustion were the couple's likely cause. The ocean sun is merciless, and with each passing hour, dehydration sets in faster. Divers float on the surface, believing help will come. But with no food, no fresh water, and nothing to shield them, their bodies weaken rapidly. A phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, stripping away clothing due to delirium, has been observed in hypothermia and heat exhaustion. It's likely what happened to them. Once they removed parts of their wetsuits and gear, they lost buoyancy. Without that, even the calmest diver can't stay afloat for long. Eileen's father, John Haynes, believed they became disoriented from the sun and salt water, drifted together, and eventually drowned, perhaps taken by the current or by sharks afterward. But there was never any clear evidence of an animal attack. The Australian media followed the story relentlessly. Locals were outraged. How could 2 people vanish in a tightly regulated diving industry without anyone noticing? The skipper of the Outer Edge had failed to perform a proper head count. No one verified the physical presence of each person. For 2 days, the Outer Edge ran new trips while Tom and Eileen were somewhere out there, floating, waiting, writing messages on a board that wouldn't be found for months. The coroner, Noel Noonan, dismissed all theories and formally charged the skipper with the unlawful killing of Tom and Eileen Lonergan. Though he was later acquitted, his company pleaded guilty to negligence. Outer Edge Dive was fined and went out of business soon after. Even years later, it still haunts people. They would have seen the dive boat vanish into a dot, and then into nothing. They would have treaded water, conserved energy, written that note, and kept believing someone would come back. The film Open Water captures that vulnerability. The slow realization that help isn't coming, that you're floating in 64 million square miles of ocean with no engine, no radio, and no idea if anyone even knows you're missing. What the movie shows is terrifying. What actually happened to Tom and Eileen Lonergan is worse, because unlike the film's characters, who at least know immediately that something went wrong, the Lonergans had to process the fact that a professional dive operation, the people they trusted with their lives, had simply forgotten they existed. Their bodies were never found. Somewhere in the Coral Sea, 2 people who joined the Peace Corps to help others, who taught children on remote islands, who loved travel and adventure, just disappeared. Not because of a shark attack, but because someone didn't count properly. On September 22, 1983, 23-year-old Tammy Oldham and her 34-year-old fiancé Richard Sharp set sail from Tahiti to San Diego aboard a 43-foot yacht they didn't own, heading toward a hurricane they knew was coming, all for a $10,000 paycheck and 2 plane tickets. 20 days later, only one of them would still be capable of spending that money. The 2018 film Adrift tells their story, though calling it their story becomes technically complicated about halfway through. Shailene Woodley plays Tammy, a free-spirited sailor who meets Richard Sharp, played by Sam Claflin, in Tahiti 5 months before everything goes sideways. They fall in love, plan trips to Japan, and when a British couple offers Richard $10,000 to deliver their luxury yacht Hazania to California, he negotiates Tommy's inclusion in both the voyage and the payment. He proposes with a handmade ring. She says yes. The ocean, as it turns out, had other plans for the registry. The film spends considerable time showing them receive warnings about Hurricane Raymond. They sail toward it anyway, because apparently $10,000 and young love create a unique form of weather-related optimism. When the storm hits, it hits with 40-foot waves and winds that essentially turn the yacht into a floating blender. Richard orders Tammy below deck, right before a wave the size of a small building flips Hazanya like a coin. Tammy's head meets the cabin wall. Richard meets the Pacific Ocean, his safety harness snaps, and he sinks while unconscious, which, given what's about to happen, might have been the more merciful outcome. Tammy wakes up 27 hours later to discover the masts are gone, the radio doesn't work, the engine won't start, and her fiancé has been returned to the sea. But here's where the film does something genuinely clever. For most of the runtime, Richard is still there. Tammy finds him clinging to the dinghy, drags him aboard despite his shattered leg and broken ribs, nurses him, talks to him, plans with him. The audience watches her care for this injured man for 41 days. Then, in one quiet moment, the camera reveals what Tammy finally accepts. The injured Richard was never there. She'd been having an extended conversation with the spot where a person should be, because the alternative was accepting that she was floating alone on a broken boat in the middle of 64 million square miles of water with no engine, no radio, and no idea if she was even heading in the right direction. The film shows her jury-rigging a sail from broken poles and storm equipment, navigating by sextant and watch like it's the 1700s, surviving on canned food while manually steering toward Hawaii. A cargo ship passes close enough for her to fire multiple flares. It sails past without slowing. On day 41, a Japanese research vessel finally spots her and tows Hazanya to shore. What the film captures with uncomfortable accuracy is how the real Tammy spent those 41 days. She did rig a makeshift sail from a broken spinnaker pole and storm jib. She did fashion a pump to drain the flooded cabin. She did determine that San Diego was no longer viable and manually plotted a 1,500-mile course to Hawaii using celestial navigation, which is the maritime equivalent of finding your way home using nothing but vibes and 18th century math. The movie's depiction of her physical deterioration, the slow realization that help isn't coming, the mental gymnastics required to keep moving forward when every single system designed to keep you alive has stopped working. These aren't Hollywood dramatizations. This is what happened when a 23-year-old woman woke up on a half-destroyed boat to discover that the universe had just handed her a multiple-choice test with only one question: keep existing or don't. What the film doesn't linger on is what it means to spend 41 days with someone who isn't there. Tammy didn't just cope with Richard's absence. Her brain manufactured an entire injured version of him, complete with broken bones and fever, someone who needed her help, who gave her a purpose beyond just not stopping. The hallucination wasn't random, it was load-bearing. It kept her making decisions, kept her problem-solving, kept her acting like someone who had a reason to reach land. When that cargo ship sailed past her flares, she questioned whether she was hallucinating that too, which raises the deeply uncomfortable question of how many other ships might have actually been there. The movie shows her returning to Tahiti after recovery, visiting Richard's boat, placing her engagement ring around a flower and releasing it into the water. The real Tammy did return. She did process what happened. And then, in what might be the most existentially defiant response to trauma possible, she kept sailing. Not occasionally, not therapeutically. She remained an avid sailor, continuing to trust the same ocean that had taken her fiancé and spent 41 days trying to finish the job. Richard Sharp was never found. His body is still out there somewhere, which means technically he's still at sea, still on that crossing to San Diego, just taking a different route than planned. In 2005, Australia released a horror film marketed with one of the film industry's favorite phrases, based on true events. And boy, does that phrase do some heavy lifting, because when you compare what actually happened with what the movie shows, it looks like someone tried to recreate a Wikipedia article after reading it once while completely drunk. Wolf Creek follows 3 backpackers, 2 British women, Liz and Christy, and their Australian friend Ben, as they road trip across Australia's outback in 1999. They stop at Wolf Creek National Park, where their watches mysteriously stop working and their car refuses to start. Hours later, a helpful local named Mick Taylor shows up, offers to tow them to his camp, and promises to fix their vehicle. Mick seems friendly enough, telling them stories while making a show of repairing the car. Then he drugs their water, and they wake up in his personal collection of horrors. Liz finds herself restrained in a shed. She manages to break free and hears Mick confronting Christy in a nearby garage. She sets their now dismantled car on fire as a distraction, injures Mick with his own rifle, and the 2 women attempt to escape in his truck. They manage to push Mick's vehicle off a cliff, a minor inconvenience for someone apparently indestructible. When Liz returns to the camp to find another vehicle, she discovers Mick's trophy room. Dozens of cars, travelers' belongings, and video cameras documenting his previous help sessions with stranded tourists. She finds footage showing Mick had been following them long before they reached Wolf Creek. Then Mick appears in the back seat of the car she's trying to steal and attacks her. The scene that follows is intentionally disturbing. He incapacitates her and demands information about Christie's location. Meanwhile, Christie reaches a highway and flags down a passing motorist. Mick stops them and disables the driver's ability to continue, then gives chase. Christie manages to sideswipe Mick's car into a ditch, but he damages her tire, causing her to crash. She attempts to crawl away, because hope is persistent even when it's pointless, and Mick uses his weapon again. He places both individuals into the motorist's car and destroys it. The film then reveals Ben's fate. He's been held in a mine shaft this entire time, in a truly unsettling position. He manages to free himself, escapes into the outback, becomes severely dehydrated, and collapses beside a dirt road. A Swedish couple finds him and gets him to a hospital. The movie ends with title cards explaining that despite multiple police searches, no trace of Liz or Christie was ever found. Early investigations were disorganized, hampered by confusion over the crime locations and the alleged unreliability of the only witness. Ben spent 4 months in police custody before being cleared of suspicion. The final shot shows Mick walking into the sunset with his rifle, still out there, still helping stranded motorists. It's a neat package: 3 victims, 1 survivor, 1 indestructible villain. Director Greg McLean crafted Mick Taylor as a distinctly Australian nightmare, part Steve Irwin, part Ivan Milat, with a dash of Bradley Murdoch thrown in for geographical accuracy. And this is where the based on true events claim starts getting creative with its definitions. Between 1989 and 1993, 7 young people disappeared while backpacking through New South Wales, Australia. 5 were foreign tourists, 3 German, 2 British, and 2 were Australians from Melbourne. All were aged 19 to 22. All vanished without explanation, their families left with nothing but unanswered questions and missing person reports that went nowhere. Unlike Wolf Creek's version, where Mick operates out of a single isolated camp and eliminates his victims efficiently, the real story unfolded across 4 years and involved a level of patience that suggests the perpetrator wasn't in any particular hurry. On September 19, 1992, 2 runners doing an orienteering exercise in Belanglo State Forest, about 15 kilometers southwest of the town of Berrima, discovered remains that had been concealed. The next morning, police found a second site 30 meters away. Dental records confirmed they were Caroline Clark, 21, and Joanne Walters, 22, 2 British backpackers last seen leaving King's Cross on April 18, 1992. Investigators determined Walters had been attacked with a sustained level of force, and Clark had been shot at close range multiple times, her body positioned in a way that suggested repetition or practice. Police conducted a thorough search of Belanglo and concluded there were no more victims. They were wrong. In October 1993, over a year later, a local man searching for firewood found bones in a remote section of the forest. Police returned and quickly located 2 bodies: James Gibson, 19, and Deborah Everest, 19, a couple from Melbourne, who'd vanished on December 30, 1989, on their way to a music festival. Gibson's remains showed he'd been struck with a large blade that severed vertebrae, immobilizing him. Additional wounds indicated he wouldn't have survived. Everest had been violently beaten and had disturbing injuries. The confusing part is that Gibson's camera had been found on December 31, 1989, beside a road at Galston Gorge in northern Sydney, over 120 kilometers away from where his body turned up. His backpack appeared 3 months later on March 13, 1990, in the same area. Someone had gone to considerable effort to create a false trail. On November 1, 1993, during a police sweep, officers found a skeleton in a clearing along a fire trail. It belonged to Simone Schmidl, 21, from Germany, missing since January 20, 1991. She'd been attacked violently. Wounds had penetrated her spine and organs. Clothing found at the scene didn't match Schmidl's description, but belonged to another missing backpacker, Anja Habschied, 20. 3 days later, on November 4th, police found Habschied and her boyfriend Gabor Neugebauer, 21, in shallow graves 50 meters apart. Habschied had been restrained, and her life ended in a particularly shocking way that involved the removal of her head, which was never recovered, either taken or disposed of elsewhere for unknown reasons. Neugebauer had been shot multiple times. Forensic evidence indicated some victims were conscious during parts of these ordeals, meaning they had time to understand the situation they were in. And honestly, that's pretty terrifying. So that's 7 people, all found in the same forest, all disposed of between 1989 and 1993 in similar ways. Left in remote bushland and camouflaged with natural materials, each victim showed signs of extended time spent with the culprit. Campsites were discovered near the body locations, suggesting he'd kept them alive for a while. Matching ammunition and cartridge boxes from 2 weapons linked all the crime scenes. The Nesses Dallas police established Task Force Air on October 14, 1993, with over 20 detectives. The government offered a $500,000 reward. Public warnings went out, particularly aimed at international backpackers, advising them to avoid hitchhiking along the Hume Highway, which is like putting up a sign that says, "Beware of leopard," after the leopard has already eaten 7 people. Police used link analysis technology on vehicle records, gym memberships, gun licenses, and internal police records, narrowing their suspect list from thousands to 230, then to 32. They were looking for a local with a 4-wheel drive, someone familiar with Belanglo State Forest, someone comfortable spending extended time in the bush. Then, on November 13, 1993, police received a call from Paul Onions, a 24-year-old in the UK. On January 25, 1990, right in the middle of the crime timeline, Onions had been hitchhiking from Liverpool Station toward Mildura when a man calling himself Bill picked him up south of Casula. Just south of Mittagong, less than 1 kilometer from Belanglo State Forest, Bill stopped the car, produced a firearm and ropes, and announced it was a robbery. Onions managed to flee while Bill pursued him and discharged the weapon several times. Onions flagged down a passing motorist named Joanne Berry, and together they sped to the Bowral police station to report the incident. The original police report had gone missing, but a constable had recorded details in her notebook, one of those minor clerical habits that occasionally prevents complete disaster. When investigators re-examined Onion's statement in April 1994, they realized he'd encountered the Belanglo killer and lived to describe him. Onions flew to Australia to assist with the investigation. On May 5, 1994, Onions positively identified a man named Ivan Milat as Bill. Unlike Mick Taylor in Wolf Creek, who operates from a remote abandoned mining camp where he's the only human for miles, Ivan Milat lived in a house at Cinnabar Street, Eagle Vale, with family nearby. He wasn't some isolated outback dweller. He was 51 years old, worked various jobs, had a wife and siblings who visited regularly. He was, by all external appearances, a normal member of society who just happened to spend his weekends engaging in activities that would eventually become one of Australia's most infamous criminal cases. Police surveillance of Milat's house began on February 26, 1994. Investigators learned he'd recently sold his silver Nissan Patrol 4-wheel drive, the same vehicle type witnesses had described shortly after the discovery of Clark and Walter's bodies. Milat hadn't been working on any of the days the victims disappeared. Acquaintances mentioned his fascination with weapons, which is the kind of detail that seems relevant in hindsight, but probably didn't raise alarms at the time because this is Australia, where plenty of people own firearms without turning into serial predators. On May 22, 1994, 50 police officers, including heavily armed Tactical Operations Unit members, surrounded Milat's home and arrested him on robbery and weapon charges related to the Onions attack. The search of his house revealed rifles and weapons consistent with those used in the crimes, along with a pistol and a large knife, the same type of weapon Mick Taylor uses in the film. Police also found foreign currency, clothing, camping equipment, a tent, sleeping bags, and cameras belonging to several victims. Searches of homes belonging to Milat's mother and 5 brothers uncovered a total of 24 weapons, 250 kilograms of ammunition, and several more items belonging to the victims. Which raises the question, was Ivan working alone, or did he have help? Police suspected the latter, given that most victims had been traveling in pairs and were approached differently. Milat's trial began on March 26, 1996. His defense strategy was to argue that despite overwhelming evidence, there was no direct proof of his guilt, and maybe his brother Richard did it. On July 27, 1996, after 18 weeks of testimony from 145 witnesses, a jury found Milat guilty of all 7 charges. He received 7 consecutive life sentences, plus 18 years without parole. Milat maintained his innocence until his death on October 27, 2019, never admitting involvement. He did, however, give a televised interview in 2004, where he denied his family had been involved, which is a weird thing to emphasize unless your family was, in fact, involved. Police believe Milat may have been connected to additional disappearances. Karen Rowland, 20, found in 1971, Peter Letcher, 18, found in 1988, and Diane Panacchio, 29, found in 1991. In 2001, he was ordered to give evidence at an inquest into 3 other missing backpackers from the Newcastle area: Leanne Goodall, Robin Hickey, and Amanda Robinson, all young women who vanished in the late 1970s while Milat was working in the area. No charges were filed due to lack of evidence, which is another way of saying everyone strongly suspected him but couldn't prove it. But Wolf Creek isn't just based on Ivan Milat. Remember Bradley Murdoch? On July 14, 2001, 7 years after Milat's arrest, British tourist Peter Falconio, 28, and his girlfriend Joanne Lees, 27, were driving along a remote stretch of highway near Barrow Creek in the Northern Territory. A man in a ute flagged them down, claiming there was something wrong with their vehicle's exhaust. Falconio got out to check. Lees heard a loud noise, then the man appeared at her window with a weapon, restrained her hands with cable ties, and covered her head with a bag. Lees managed to escape and hid in bushes for 5 hours before flagging down a road train driver. Peter Falconio's body was never found. In December 2005, Bradley John Murdoch, a drug runner with a criminal history, was convicted of Falconio's murder based on DNA evidence found on Lees's clothing. He received a life sentence with a 28-year non-parole period. So when Wolf Creek's marketing claimed it was based on true events, they meant they took Ivan Milat's 7 victims in Belanglo State Forest, combined them with Bradley Murdoch's Outback Highway attack, relocated everything to Western Australia for cinematic purposes, compressed 4 years of crimes into a single night, added a helpful Swedish couple who weren't part of either real case, and invented an ending where the killer walks free into the sunset. The movie's title cards claim Ben spent 4 months in police custody before being cleared. In reality, Paul Onions, the actual survivor, was never a suspect. He was the witness who helped convict Milat, for which he later received a $200,000 reward that he accepted but reportedly never used. Joanne Lees, who survived Murdoch's attack, was subjected to intense media scrutiny and public skepticism about her story, particularly in Australia, where armchair detectives questioned why she couldn't provide more details about her attacker, or why she'd hidden in the bushes for 5 hours instead of immediately seeking help, as if there's a proper protocol for being confronted by a stranger in the outback. The film ends with Mick walking into the sunset, still out there, still helping travelers. It's meant to be chilling, a reminder that evil persists, except both real offenders were caught, tried, and imprisoned. Milat died in a prison cell at age 74. Murdoch is currently serving his sentence in Darwin's Berrima prison. Neither walked into any sunsets. Here's what Wolf Creek gets right, though. The Australian outback is vast, isolated, and indifferent to human suffering. Travelers do break down in remote areas. People do accept help from strangers because the alternative is staying stranded in a place where dehydration will end you long before help arrives. The film accurately captures the vulnerability of being in an environment where cell phones don't work, roads are empty for hours, and the nearest town is far enough away that screaming is pointless. What it gets wrong is almost everything else. Wolf Creek spawned a franchise, a sequel, a TV series, and another film currently in production. In 1994, Peter Jackson, who would later become famous for making 3-hour movies about walking to a volcano, directed a film about 2 teenage girls whose friendship was so intense it could only end in blinding someone with a brick in a stocking. Heavenly Creatures launched the careers of Kate Winslet and Melanie Linsky, won awards at Venice, and received an Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay, which is Hollywood's way of saying well-crafted story about matricide. The film follows Juliet Hume and Pauline Parker, who meet in 1952 Christchurch. They're both 13 or 14. Both survived serious childhood illnesses that left them hospitalized and isolated. Both feel like outsiders. Juliet is wealthy, English, outspoken. Pauline is working class, hostile toward her mother Honora, and finds refuge at the Hume household, where she feels accepted. Together they create Barovnia, a fantasy kingdom where they write adventure novels they're convinced will get published and made into Hollywood films, because teenage delusions of grandeur have never met a reality check they couldn't ignore. They develop a belief system called the Fourth World, essentially their version of heaven where there are no Christians and art is celebrated. During a day trip to Port Levy, when Juliet's parents announce they're leaving her alone for a trip, she becomes hysterical and experiences the Fourth World as a visible paradise. She asks Pauline to come with her, and suddenly both can see it, which either confirms their spiritual enlightenment or suggests folie à deux. depending on whether you consult theology or psychiatry. When Juliet is sent to a tuberculosis clinic, they write letters to each other as themselves and as Barovnian royalty, because why have one identity when you can have several? Their fantasy life intensifies, complete with increasingly violent scenarios about people who oppose them. After Juliet's release, their relationship concerns both sets of parents. Juliet's father speaks to Pauline's parents, who take her to a doctor. The doctor suspects she's homosexual, which in 1950s New Zealand was considered a mental illness rather than just someone's business, and uses it to explain her weight loss and anger. Then Juliet's parents announce their divorce. Juliet will be sent to live with relatives in South Africa. The girls, distraught at the thought of separation, plan to run away together. When that becomes impossible, they share a bathtub and discuss eliminating Pauline's mother, whom they view as the primary obstacle to staying together. After 3 weeks at Juliet's house finalizing plans, they execute their scheme. On June 22, 1954, the three go to Victoria Park. After tea, they walk down a steep hillside path. When Honora bends to pick up a pink charm the girls deliberately dropped, they burn her with a brick wrapped in an old stocking. The film ends with text revealing both were arrested, sentenced to 5 years, too young for the alternative, and released in 1959 with the condition they never contact each other again. The actual events followed the film's timeline with remarkable accuracy, which is either a testament to Peter Jackson's research or proof that sometimes reality doesn't need embellishment. Pauline Parker was born May 26, 1938. Juliet Hume was born October 28, 1938, in London, emigrating to New Zealand in 1948, when her father became rector of University of Canterbury. The girls met at Christchurch Girls' High School in their early teens. Parker's parents, Herbert Reaper and Honora Parker, weren't actually married, though they lived together. This fact only emerged during the trial, because apparently people cared intensely about that sort of thing in 1954. Both had survived serious childhood illnesses. Parker had osteomyelitis, Hume had tuberculosis, which formed their initial bond, proving that shared trauma is an excellent foundation for friendship and occasionally premeditated violence. They developed an elaborate fantasy world, writing plays and stories, creating their own religion with their own saints, and rejecting Christianity in favor of the fourth world, their personal paradise they believed they could occasionally enter during moments of enlightenment. Parker's parents grew concerned the girls were engaged in an inappropriate relationship. The Humes shared this concern. Both families continued allowing them to see each other anyway, because nothing says, "we're worried about you," like enabling the exact behavior you find concerning. Parker was welcomed at the Hume home for overnights and vacations. Hume became withdrawn and physically ill when Parker left without her, which is either deep friendship or codependency, and the line between the two has always been conveniently blurry. In 1953, Parker wasn't invited to Ilam for summer holidays, as she had been previously. In 1954, the Hume family structure collapsed. The parents separated. Hume's father was forced to resign as rector due to problems with faculty and the board, and her mother was involved in an extramarital situation. The family planned to return to England, but Juliet would be sent to South Africa to live with relatives, ostensibly for her health. Both girls decided Parker should accompany Hume to South Africa. They thought the Humes would agree. Parker was certain her mother wouldn't. The solution, they determined, was to remove Honora from the equation entirely, then proceed to South Africa before heading to Hollywood or New York, where their writing would obviously make them famous, because 16-year-olds who've just committed matricide are exactly what the entertainment industry is looking for. On the afternoon of June 22, 1954, Parker, Hume, and Honora had tea at a kiosk in Victoria Park. They walked through a wooded area, approximately 130 meters down a path, when Honora bent to retrieve a pink charm the girls had dropped. Because even premeditated violence requires props, they struck her repeatedly with half a brick enclosed in an old stocking. The stocking was a practical touch, better grip, fewer identifying marks on the weapon, and it prevented the brick from shattering, which would have been inconvenient. After the act, they ran back to the tea kiosk and told Agnes and Kenneth Ritchie, the owners, that Honora had fallen and hit her head. Ritchie discovered the body shortly thereafter. Major lacerations were found on Honora's head, neck, and face, with minor injuries to her fingers where she'd attempted to defend herself. Police found the weapon nearby. The girl's story of accidental death lasted approximately as long as it takes to realize that people don't typically sustain 45 separate injuries from a single fall. The trial was sensational. Speculation centered on the girl's possible intimate relationship and potential insanity. On August 28, 1954, Parker and Hume were convicted. Too young for execution, each received 5 years in prison. Hume served her sentence at Mount Eden in Auckland. Some sources claim they were released with the condition they never contact each other again, though Sam Barnett, then Secretary for Justice, told journalists no such condition existed. Hume's release was unconditional. She immediately rejoined her father in Italy. Parker was placed on 6 months parole in New Zealand before leaving the country. Less than 4 months after the trial, the murder was cited as evidence of moral decline in the Mazengarb Report on Juvenile Delinquency, because nothing helps process a tragedy like using it to confirm your pre-existing beliefs about society's deterioration. After release, Parker assumed the identity Hilary Nathan and spent time in New Zealand under surveillance before relocating to England. By 1992, she lived in the village of Hoo, near Kent, running a children's riding school, which is either evidence of rehabilitation or an interesting career choice for someone convicted of violent crime. She became a devout Roman Catholic. She never spoke to the press but released a 1996 statement through her sister expressing remorse and noting she'd spent 40 years repaying her crime by keeping away from people and doing her own little thing. Her sister added that after the event, Parker was very sorry, though it took her about 5 years to realize what she had done, which raises questions about what exactly she thought she'd done during those first 5 years. Hume spent time in England and the United States before settling in Scotland, where she became a successful historical detective novelist under the name Anne Perry. She joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints around 1968, which is either genuine spiritual transformation or an impressive commitment to reinvention. Until 1994, when Jackson's film was released, Perry's identity as Julme Hume wasn't widely known. In March 2006, she stated that while her relationship with Parker was obsessive, they were not romantically involved, setting the record straight on precisely which aspects of their shared history were pathological. Anne Perry died April 10, 2023, at age 84, having lived 69 years beyond the crime that defined her youth. She built a successful writing career creating fictional murder, which is either therapeutic sublimation or evidence that we never fully escape our past. We just find more socially acceptable ways to revisit it. Pauline Parker, now Hilary Nathan, remains alive, still living quietly in England, still operating that riding school, still having never given an interview about that afternoon in Victoria Park, when she and her best friend decided that the obstacle to their friendship wasn't their obsessive codependency or their shared detachment from reality, but one woman who had the misfortune of being a mother when her daughter needed an excuse.